recording. I am going to stop sharing. I would like to welcome everybody to this Arlington Historical Society event. And we want to thank all of you for attending. We opened the waiting room early tonight because we had such a large number of attendees, and we're really excited that we have this great deal of interest in the African-American troops during the Civil War. I'd like to welcome our speakers, Edward Gantt, Ben Hawley, and Michael Schaffner. And I am going to turn the presentation over to them as I still continue to admit people into the program. And I ask that you keep your video and audio muted throughout the program so you can hear the speaker. If you have a question, you should have a little chat button at the bottom of your screen, and you can ask questions via chat. We have somebody moderating those chat questions that will come on at the end, and will be able to give us a little bit more information and pose some of the questions, and then we will unmute for additional questions. So once again, we thank you. Sit back and enjoy this insight back to the 1860s.
Thank you, Kathy.
Yes.
I'm Ben Hawley. Tonight, I'll be sharing a little information or background on B Company, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Interesting story on how the unit was formed. Back in 1990 or thereabouts, TriStar, a Hollywood movie company, was interested in making a movie about black soldiers in the Civil War. Well, they looked around and guess what? There were no black Civil War reenactors. After talking with a few members from the National Park Service, the Park Service began making inquiries and was able to recruit enough men for the movie. The name of the movie that I'm talking about is Glory. I hope that most of you or all of you have seen it. It's a very good movie, and I recommend it. Glory is a story about the men in the original group. Now, I've been reenacting with the 54th since 1991 and have enjoyed myself immensely. Our company has a reputation for the best drilled and the finest dressed in the Civil War community. One of the things you will hear are historical accuracy. Our group strives to recreate soldiers of the 54th exactly as they were. We wear uniforms, not costumes, just like they did right down to the shoes. Shoes known as Jefferson Brogues, socks and shirts. No air mattresses in our pup tents, no coolers, none of that 21st century stuff. I have had the opportunity to travel all over the country sharing our story. One of the interesting things that the soldiers did was help each other to read and write. I found this aspect of reenacting very inspirational. Here you had men that were sons of professional men, tradesmen, doctors, lawyers, and more. And amongst that group, there were slaves, ex-slaves, and there was no class distinction. The professional men, the tradesmen, doctors, lawyers, they all were bent over backwards to help the colored slave. One of the things, if you were to ask a black soldier why he was in this war or why he's fighting, he would tell you probably one of two things. I want to free my brothers that are in chains, and two, I want to keep the Union together. Frederick Douglass had two sons in the 54th. One thing, we seem to recruit our lawyers. Okay, one thing, again, like I said, Company B seems to always able to recruit lawyers. Maybe it's the Washington area with all the lawyers, I don't know. Let's see. Our unit consists of men from every walk of life. doctors. We even have a real doctor in our ranks. We're always recruiting soldiers and would be delighted to replace some of our older members, myself included. Our website is www.54thmass.org. Check us out. As a 501c3 organization, we accept tax-deductible donations. Thank you so much for your attention. Back to you, Kathy.
My name is Michael Schaffner. I grew up in Arlington, and when we were growing up in the 60s and 70s, you would hear everything you'd want to hear about Robert E. Lee, some of which was actually true. But I never learned until a few years ago that there were 2 regiments of African American soldiers raised in Arlington during the Civil War. And that's just the way history was taught back then. I was really excited to learn that. I've since been to the archives and photographed the regimental books, and I've spent a couple of years transcribing them and writing up the finding. All right. Just to give some background, as soon as the shooting started in 1861, enslaved African Americans were trying to get to United States lines. In fact, in Pensacola, a week before Sumter, people were trying to flee to United States fortifications or outposts, and the numbers steadily grew from the beginning of the war. And that process of self-emancipation drove the federal government's response. By the time you get to the middle of 1862, there are so many African Americans who were with the Army of the Potomac on the peninsula, acting as laborers, teamsters, officers, servants, that Congress is at last compelled to regularize the process. So in July of 1862, they actually amend the Militia Act, allowing African Americans to work for the Army and get paid. And they also have a phrase in there that said that they could also be used in any military or naval service for which they may be found competent. And in South Carolina, General Hunter found them competent to serve as soldiers. And a month after that, you have Benjamin Butler in New Orleans raising a regiment of Louisiana Native Guard, they were called. So by the end of 1863, especially after the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, you have several regional commanders who begun to hire African-American soldiers, enlist African Americans into the ranks of the United States Army. After the Emancipation Proclamation, it really takes off. And to such an extent that the War Department in early 1863, in May, establishes the Bureau of Colored Troops within the Adjutant General's office. And their responsibility is to federalize recruitment of African American soldiers. There's already a regiment being raised in the District of Columbia, the 1st District of Columbia Colored. That rapidly becomes the 1st United States Colored Troops. It's mustered into United States service in Washington, and the Bureau of Colored Troops assigns the officers. They immediately go to work recruiting a second one, this one entirely by the federal government. So the 2nd United States Colored Troops is the 1st African American regiment raised directly by the federal government instead of by a local department commander, or as in Massachusetts, the governor of the state. Because it's a federal organization, they're able to set up recruiting offices all over the country. And as soon as in one place you get enough men to form up a company or two, they can centralize them at training camps, bring them from throughout a region, and assign officers. So in the case of the 2nd United States Colored Troops, which is being organized in Camp Casey, then in Alexandria County, but even then also known as Arlington, the first 2 companies are men who are from Norfolk and Portsmouth. Company A from Norfolk is laborers and teamsters and officers, servants who've been working with the Army for up to a year. Portsmouth is a bunch of refugees from enslavement who are farmers. Those 2 companies are, brought to company strength, 100 men each, sent to Arlington, where they join Company C, which is actually raised in Arlington from some of the actually from some of the people who are already working within the defenses of Washington. People whose families are living at Freedman's Valley or Freedman's Village and in Green Valley. After that, step by step, they raised the additional 7 companies. 5 of them are raised in the District of Columbia, or enlisted in the District of Columbia, then sent across the Long Bridge to Arlington. There are also 2 from Baltimore. And it's interesting, between those 2 companies from Baltimore, you have 78 men from Talbot County, which if you've been following in the paper has got a Confederate memorial to 84 men who joined the Confederate Army from Talbot. There are 78 in the 2nd USCT alone. So probably there are several times the number of African Americans from Talbot County who served in the United States Army as there are white men from Talbot who served in the Confederate Army. From late June to November, you get 1,000 African American soldiers and their white officers who are training and organizing in Arlington County. About 2/3 of the men are born and raised in the greater DC area, counties around Washington, DC, and the other 40% are split between the Norfolk Portsmouth area and Baltimore and the Eastern Shore. The guys from Norfolk and Portsmouth are interesting for another reason. These are men from the counties in Virginia, south of the James, between the Nansemond River and the Cape, and North Carolina between Albemarle Sound, Chowan River, and Currituck Sound. This is one of the oldest populations of African descended people in the United States. There are people here, there are men in this regiment whose family probably date back to before the Mayflower. There's at least 1 man in the company who was a teenager during Nat Turner's rebellion. There are 6 other men who are from Southampton County, so they grew up hearing stories of Nat Turner. And I think there's a little poetic justice in the idea that now these sons of Nat Turner are getting muskets in their hands in the United States Army uniform, and they're going to come down south and help free their people, free other Americans. Besides the Teamsters, officer servants, laborers, you have waiters, barbers, blacksmiths, farmers, oyster fishers, they called them, sailors, and there are a dozen other trades. 3/4 of them are volunteers or substitutes, men who've taken the place of someone who was drafted for a financial consideration. The remainder are draftees, willing and a few of them unwilling. 30% were free when the war started. And that includes a dozen men who the Bureau of Colored Troops has drafted in New York and is reassigned to this regiment being raised in the DC area to provide additional literate men to serve as non-commissioned officers. Now, the officer ranks are being filled by examining white applicants. And there are several reasons for why they limit the officer ranks almost entirely to white men. You can ask about them later. Mostly it has to do with racism and its variations. But the thing is, it's not an easy interview. The Washington Board of Examination, if you want to apply to be an officer in the United States Colored Troops, you got to sit for an interview of an hour or 2 with a number of senior officers. They're going to fire questions at you from the United States Army regulations, 572 pages of regulations, and infantry tactics they're going to ask you about. There's another like 500 pages of these on the different formations and how you conduct troops in battle. It's called Casey's infantry tactics. And of course, the person conducting the interview is Major General Silas Casey. So you need to know as much as he does about how a battalion of infantry is supposed to operate in the field. The officers are from all over the country. The first colonel is a young man named Stark Fellows. It sounds very imposing. He was actually a 22-year-old law school graduate from Dartmouth, originally from New Hampshire. The average height of all the men and Colonel Fellows himself is 5 feet 6 inches. The average age is 23 years. Colonel Fellows is 22. They're not young, they're not very tall, but when they're trained, they're described by a man, later the Lieutenant Colonel John Wilder, he says, they were drilled with an efficiency and exactness that perhaps not a regiment in the service, regular or volunteer, surpassed. With shining muskets, white gloves, glittering brasses, and a light springy step, they looked the very beau ideal of black soldiery. There's a correspondent of the Weekly Anglo-African who met with some of the men in camp. And after he'd been done shaking hands with them and saying hello, he recorded that his arm felt like as if it had been using sledgehammers all day. And here, let me assure you that when these boys get into battle, somebody will be hurt. In November, they take their trains for New York, and from New York, they head on to New Orleans, where they spend about a week. Then they're sent to Ship Island, Mississippi, and ultimately, in February of 1864, they end up in Key West. And of course, the question is, what's the job there? In Key West, they have 3 missions, one of which is just to protect Key West, garrison Fort Taylor, also garrison the city. Key West is the site, the home port actually, of the East Gulf Blockading Squadron. It's a ragtag flotilla whose beat runs from Cape Canaveral in the Atlantic all the way around the peninsula up to Pensacola. Their second job is to protect refugees on the west coast of Florida. About 40% of Florida's population in 1860 are enslaved Americans. And of course, like everywhere else, Black people, as soon as the fighting starts, are trying to get out of Dodge and win their freedom. There's also a number of white refugees. Most of these men are cattlemen, and the Confederate government has just lifted the draft exemption for men who, for cattlemen. And rather than be conscripted in the Confederate Army and shipped off to Virginia or Georgia, a number of folks, I'm getting my screen cut off. All right. A number of folks,
Me too.
what is happening here? All right. All right. Can you all still hear me at least?
Yes.
All right, thank you, Ben. So the United States government is able to raise from these refugees 2 small battalions of cavalry, the 1st and the 2nd Florida Cavalry U.S. The 2nd is supposed to send troops to give them some additional muscle and backup. And then the 3rd mission that they have is to take up the offense and go into the interior of Florida and cut rebel supply lines. Because in 1860, while the whole state has only 140,000 people, they have something close to 400,000 head of cattle. And after Vicksburg falls and Texas is cut off from the rest of the Confederacy, Florida cattle is the main supply of beef for the Confederate Army. Confederate commissaries hoping to get 12,000 head a month out of the area, basically around Tampa and parts south, in from the West Coast. And it's going to be the job of the 2nd Florida and the 2nd United States Colored Troops to make sure that they don't get their 12,000 head of cattle a month. Before I get too far into that, though, back in Key West in April of 1864, there's a much more immediate enemy. Yellow fever hits, and it soon begins killing people. And the first man in the regiment to die is the chaplain. And the second man to die of yellow fever in the regiment is Colonel Stark Fellows himself, the young man who put the whole regiment together and trained them for war. Within the next month or so, another 6 officers will die, 2 company commanders and 4 lieutenants, including some poor young 2nd lieutenant who had just showed up at Key West from New Orleans 10 days previously. By the time the fever runs its course, they're going to lose 11 officers to it. And that's more than half the officers of the regiment who are then in Key West. What keeps the regiment from falling apart and holds it together are the African-American non-commissioned officers, starting with Sergeant Major Theodore Brown. He's from Binghamton, New York. Quartermaster Richard Bruff is from Norristown, Pennsylvania. Both of them were free at the beginning of the war. And then there's Commissary James Taylor of Albemarle, Virginia. In addition to that, there are 50 or 60 corporals, sergeants, and first sergeants. They keep it all together until the Bureau of Colored Troops and the surviving officers can get their act together. Now, back in Florida, the 2nd Florida Cavalry, known as cow hunters, and the 2nd United States Infantry, United States Colored Troops, are now have to take on the Confederate cavalry regiment that's supposed to safeguard the cattle herds. They're called the cow cavalry. So you have this weird sort of guerrilla warfare going on in West Florida between these small companies and platoons of cow hunters, colored troops, and cow cavalry. And both of them are operating, it's small groups because they're both operating at the extreme end of their chain of communications. In May, the United States forces clear out Tampa. They capture a stash of Confederate supplies, spike the guns in the harbor, and then go back to Key West, and then come back 2 weeks later and hit Fort Meade, which is an old Seminole War fort that the cow cavalry is centered on. They pillage it and then burn it to the ground. At station number 4 on the Florida Railroad, a platoon of the 2nd United States Colored Infantry under Sergeant William Wilson, a black NCO, settle a fight with cow cavalry by fixing bayonets and charging. There's also fighting down at Fort Myers, and additional raids that run through the end of the summer. Of course, between these operations of the 2 2nd regiments, Florida Cavalry and United States Colored Infantry, instead of getting 12,000 head of cattle a month, or the 6,000 that Confederate commissaries thought they could actually get, it's down to about 1,200 to 2,000 a month. So instead of being able to come up with the beef rations for essentially a third of the Confederate Army east of the Mississippi, they're basically left able to support the troops in Florida and some of the troops in Charleston. Fighting flares up again in early 1865 with another action around station number 4 near Cedar Keys. There's a rebel counterattack at Fort Myers that falls apart, and the war essentially ends in that area. And finally, have the biggest battle, the 2nd United States Colored Infantry. They land at St. Mark's, and together with a few companies of the 99th United States Colored Infantry, who are all Louisianans, they make an approach on Tallahassee, and the 800 of them run into about 1,200 Confederates in a fairly well-prepared position. And after 5 or 6 hours, they pull back with the heaviest losses they're going to suffer in the war, about 140 casualties between the 2 regiments. 3 more officers are killed in action. The only officers who die of disease die of yellow fever. The only officers who kill in action die at Natural Bridge. And I should scroll back and talk about, just mention briefly that while 11 officers die of yellow fever in Key West, a large part of the regiment gets sick, but only 4 enlisted men die from yellow fever. So that's one reason the NCOs are able to hold things together. After Natural Bridge, it's a totally useless battle. A few weeks later, the Confederacy collapses. The regiment scatters to occupation duty in Florida, and ultimately, in January of 1866, they're mustered out. Now, I want to end with quick profiles of 3 of the soldiers, but I also want to point out that together, not only they keep Key West secured, not that there was a big Confederate Navy that was going to pose a major threat, but they did They did provide security, but they also helped free 1,000 enslaved people who ran off from the Confederacy. 144 of whom they recruited into the ranks of the regiment. So the companies of the 2nd USCI never dropped below 80 or 90 men each. They're filling, that's another advantage of being a national regiment. They can recruit wherever they are. With all the beef they took from the rebels, they and the 2nd Florida Cavalry eat well, but also so does the United States Army and Navy and the Department of the Gulf. And as Wilder said, they all wax fat on the spoils of the land while literally starving the Confederacy. Anyway, to wrap it up, I just want to talk about 3 of the individual soldiers who were in the regiment. A hero, a scholar, and a rogue. The hero is Arthur Walker. He was born enslaved in Fauquier County, Virginia. He was working as a waiter in Washington when the regiment was recruiting, and he enlisted at age 22 in Company G. He immediately became first sergeant. And I should say that waiters at that time, African-American waiters in the district, were generally literate, numerate, and of course knew how to work with white people. Barbers too. They were the first USCT, a quarter of the NCOs were waiters and barbers. He becomes a first sergeant, and then he ends up at Natural Bridge, where his captain writes in the descriptive book, was twice severely wounded and declined to go to the rear, but gallantly stood by his comrades until he was finally shot through the head and killed instantly. A brave and most excellent soldier. No other man in the regiment has a comment like that in their descriptive list. I mean, obviously there was whatever the officers felt at the beginning of the war about Black people, and if they were like Stark fellows from New Hampshire, they may never have seen a Black person until they got in the Army. By the end of the war, there is a bond. A luckier man was—
Michael?
Yes?
Could you give that gentleman's name again? Somebody just wrote that in chat. The hero.
Arthur Walker.
Thank you.
Arthur Walker. The second man has an easier to remember name. He was called Richard Burton. He was born enslaved in Madison County, Virginia. He was a farmer who worked as an Army Teamster, enlisted in Company C at age 21. He was a private, he became a corporal, he became a sergeant, and at the beginning of 1865, he became a quartermaster sergeant of the regiment. And in the general order that appointed him to that position, they wrote, actually the colonel at the time wrote, when Sergeant Burton originally joined the regiment, he was unable to read or write his own name. But by close application to his studies, he has since learned to read and to write a good hand, and has thus qualified himself for this position. The colonel hopes that others in the regiment will emulate his example, not only by preparing themselves for promotion in the regiment, but also for a life of usefulness hereafter, when they shall no longer be soldiers, but become citizens of the United States. And I always sort of choke up a little at that, because by the end of the war, that may have been African Americans' goal all along. But by the end of the war, it's all the officers' goals, and it's a goal of everyone who's read about and followed the exploits of African American soldiers. And then the last person, just to show that not everyone's a saint, has the name of John Halleck. No relation to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, though they do share the same last name. He was a substitute, originally born in New York. First we hear of him is that he's jailed in Fort Taylor for unspecified crimes. And I think in July, they find out the officer commanding writes to the Ordnance Department complaining that the bars of his cell were set in a wooden sash. And Halleck has somehow managed to whittle them out so well that he can take them out and put them back either from the inside of his cell or the outside. And they actually catch him not escaping from jail, but returning from a visit to Key West. And they find out that he's done this a number of times over the weeks. I think they move him to a more secure cell. I should say the really remarkable thing about him sneaking out of jail and then sneaking back into jail is that right then, Fort Taylor the water's been filled in since then. Now it adjoins Key West. At that time, there was a quarter-mile of open water between Fort Taylor and the town. So I don't know how John Halleck did it, but he had to basically cross half a mile of water coming and going each evening he decided to go out and visit town. There had to be a woman involved. Anyway, that's not the end of his story. Beginning of 65, he's sent back to his company. He's at the Battle of Natural Bridge. He's severely wounded, left behind, and you think that should be the end of him. But we find out in June, he shows up in Annapolis, released by the Confederates. He had been captured, held as a prisoner of war. So somehow, over the course of his military career, and of course, there's a general order that says, when you get out of returning POWs, immediately get an honorable discharge. So John Halleck, who has been worse than useless to the Army for nearly the entirety of his career, finally ends up doing his good service as a soldier in the Battle of Natural Bridge, survives his wounds, survives Confederate capacity, ends up in Annapolis, getting out with an honorable discharge 6 months before all the other soldiers in the regiment who behaved themselves. And I just want to say, I don't know what kind of medal you would give for that, but I think he deserved one. And thank you for listening to all this. That's a capsule version of the history of the 2nd United States Colored Infantry, the 1st Regiment trained in Arlington, but right behind it came the 23rd United States Colored Troops, and Captain Ed Gantt will talk about that. Thank you all very much.
Good evening.
Good evening, Ed.
I don't have anything showing on my screen, but if you can see me, I'll just proceed.
I can see you.
I can see you.
Very well. As Captain Shaffner said, I'm Ed Gantt with the 23rd Regiment U.S. Colored Troops. Just to give you something that helps you understand, a regiment was approximately 1,000 infantry soldiers. The 23rd was one of 142 U.S. Colored Troop infantry regiments. There were another 7 or so cavalry regiments and another 14 artillery regiments, but altogether close to 200,000 African-American soldiers by the end of the Civil War. So the 23rd, it came into being in the fall of 1863. It was formed right in what is now Arlington, but at that time was still Alexandria, on the Virginia side of the Potomac River, just across from Washington, D.C., on or immediately adjacent to the Custis Lee plantation. When we were formed, following the Emancipation Proclamation and the creation of the Bureau of Colored Troops, and as the captain said, that bureau went through many of the contraband camps to recruit, and that's exactly what happened right here in this area at Freedman's Village, which was a contraband camp and grew to be quite sizable, with either runaways or self-emancipated former enslaved people, all living right there in that vicinity near where the Pentagon is located today. So heavily recruited in contraband camps. A third of the 23rd Regiment came from Virginia. Another third came from Maryland, and that final Maryland and Washington, D.C. And that final third came from any place else where they could get troops. So after being formed and trained in the fall of 1863, by the spring of 1864, the 23rd had become part of the Army of the Potomac, and they were headed toward Central Virginia with General Meade. We were assigned to the 9th Corps, and a corps is approximately 10,000 soldiers. The 9th Corps was under Ambrose Burnside. You've heard his name before. He pops up in a number of engagements during the Civil War, and he's well known for having the hairy appurtenances down the side of his face that we all know are sideburns now. So we were with General Burnside on into central Virginia, and by May of 1864, the 23rd was engaged at the Battle of the Wilderness near Fredericksburg, and then the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. The 23rd Regiment had the distinction of being the first U.S. colored troop regiment to become engaged in combat against the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. And that happened in mid-May in 1864 near Spotsylvania. There is a roadside marker dedicated to that first skirmish between U.S. colored troops and Robert E. Lee's army that happened near the Aldrich Farm down near Fredericksburg. After that action near Spotsylvania and Fredericksburg, then General Meade, under General Grant's leadership, continued in pursuit and engagement with Robert E. Lee in the area east of Richmond. The 23rd continues with the Union Army and ends up in the siege at Petersburg that happens as early as June and lasted through the end of the year. One battle of note involving the 23rd was the Battle of the Crater, July 30th of 1864. And that's an interesting battle worth studying. We won't get too involved into the details of the Battle of the Crater right now, but this is during the siege of Petersburg as the Union Army is attempting to break through the Confederate fortifications. And they were unsuccessful up until that point. The miners who were part of the Union Army decided to bore a hole under the Confederate fortification loaded with explosives and create an opening where the Union Army would rush through the hole. Well, it ended up with a 30-foot deep, 60 feet wide, and the soldiers who went into the crater were summarily slaughtered. Some were shot while trying to surrender. So it was not a successful engagement, but the 23rd suffered the largest numbers of casualties. Now, at the same time, or near the same time, also in July of 1864, there was a small contingent of the 23rd that was still here up at Camp Casey. And as the word was passed that General Jubal Early was headed toward Washington, D.C. to attack some part of the city, that contingent, people who had joined the 23rd too late to finish training, or those who had not completed because of medical problems, and anyone else who was still at Camp Casey, was mobilized and marched through Washington, D.C. to go up to the northwest portion of the city to assist in bolstering Fort Stevens, which became the only battle of the Civil War that was fought inside Washington, D.C., July 9th through the 11th timeframe. But the largest contingent was down at Petersburg. So continuing with the siege at Petersburg until late in 1864, when this new corps, the 25th Corps, which was made up of all U.S. colored troops, an entire Army Corps of about 10,000 troops, was formed in December of that year, 1864, and the 23rd was moved over to the 25th, and it's with the 25th Corps that the 23rd Regiment marched into Richmond in April of, first Petersburg surrendered and then marched into Richmond in April of 1865. Following their entry into Richmond, the 23rd proceeded on west to Appomattox, and they were there for the surrender of General Lee's army. Immediately after the surrender, the 23rd was sent to Texas for border security patrol against Napoleon III. There was some belief that Mexico may attempt to reclaim Texas. So the 23rd remained on Texas duty until December of that year, and then in January of 1866, the 23rd U.S. Colored Troop organization was disbanded. After the war, many of the U.S. colored troops returned to their home areas. There are a number of of one-room schoolhouses that were built by former soldiers of the USCT. But one of the more difficult aspects is that few of the black soldiers who fought in the Civil War went back home and placed a picture of themselves up over the mantle and pointed with pride to their having fought for the Union Army, because at that time most of the African Americans living in the country were still living in the southern half of the United States. And I don't think that that would have gone over very well, living in South Carolina, Georgia, or Alabama, to have Granddad's picture on the mantelpiece wearing a blue uniform during those days. So I'd like to go ahead and cut it off right here and leave a little bit of time for some discussion and some fielding of questions. But again, the 23rd Regiment raised, informed, and trained right here in what is Arlington now. So you can claim part ownership to having formed that Union regiment that fought bravely from the middle of 1864 on through the end of 1865. Thank you.
All right, we're turning it over to you, Ben, to close. Is that correct?
Correct. Ed, thank you very much. Very enlightening. And Mike, you as well. Ladies and gentlemen, you've had two of our speakers talking about the second USCT, which was in Arlington. And then Ed Gantt talked about the 23rd USCT. Both units, I don't think, get enough press. I want to talk to, before I turn it over to questions and answers, I just want to take a little time and talk about the black soldier. You know, the black soldier didn't have any experience militarily, never held a weapon, never fired a weapon, and he learned how to fire it, and was very courageous and something to be proud of. Kathy, can you put that one of my slides up, the 54th, if you can find it, and I'll just keep talking until we get ready to get to the question and answer period. Black soldiers were very, keep going. There.
Harry Wagner.
Yeah. Oh no, this is good. This is the most current photograph we have. This is probably from 1990, 91. And out front is Captain Jack Thompson. Jack was a good friend of, I forget his name. He's very famous in Civil War history. Anyway.
Pohanka?
Yeah, Pohanka. Yeah, Brian and Jack were famous friends. And I talked to Brian a lot of times, and Brian would give me history, things that were important to know. You know, as I talk, it's important for us to understand, here's a story that we really don't know about. Well, some of us know, but depending on where you went to school. Ed talked about down in Georgia and South Carolina. I'm sure they didn't talk about USCTs. I happen to be descended from somebody in the 29th Regiment out of Connecticut. A quick story, if I can. This fellow named Fred Wood. Fred was from Frederick, Virginia. He was working on a plantation. Actually, it was tobacco. It was a tobacco farm because they didn't have cotton plantations. Anyway, he walked from Frederick to Gettysburg. That's a good 40, 50 miles because he wanted to enlist. And he hooked a ride somehow in Gettysburg up to Pennsylvania, where he caught another ride to Connecticut to sign in and volunteer up there. Fred served valiantly. He came back and went to work for the Library of Congress. In 1906, he was like a greeter. He worked at the Library of Congress and was a greeter. He was paid around $250 a month, which in 1960 terms is very good. I checked this out. I have several friends in the Library of Congress, and they validated this story. My point here is it's these men, we march and we represent them. I tell our guys when we're marching somewhere, it's not about you. It's about the men that you represent. As you march by, you march and people are yelling, "Give them hell, 54th, give them hell." We were in Boston dedicating the memorial, the St. Gaudens Memorial. And we were coming up from the waterfront to the memorial. And we had to march on cobblestones. And as we marched, somebody started a fife and drum, and a fife, and then somebody started playing the drums, and it was surreal. It was really surreal. There was, out of 40 men, there were tears in everybody's eyes. Even the crowd was crying. It was just so strange. But my intent here in telling this is so that you get some sense of our history. Now we're getting a chance to share this. And from the 54th, that's our charge. Our charge is to share this history with everybody. So many people never heard of the 54th, the 29th, the 23rd, the 2nd USCT. It was a difficult time for the black soldier. He didn't always get paid. Well, he didn't always get full pay. He started out half pay, and they worked up that until about 1864. 64. And I get angry sometimes when I see they withheld his pay for that reason. That was crazy. Some valiant warriors they were. Anyway, that's my spiel on the 54th. Please list your questions and we'll get to them. Kathy?
This is Jessica.
And Jessica has questions that she has some questions that she wants to share.
Yeah, I've been looking at the various questions that have come on the chat, and I'm going to bring up some of them. But if anyone else has a question while some of these are being answered, feel free to ask the question on chat, and I will verbally ask it to our speakers. I'm going to start with my own question, if you don't mind. And first of all, actually, I'm not going to start with my own. Somebody wanted to know exactly where Camp Casey was. Do you all know? And then I want to go from Camp Casey to ask about, if you could talk a little bit about what life was like at Camp Casey for the Black troops and how long you trained there.
Camp Casey, I think, is somewhere along Columbia Pike, probably between the Air Force Memorial and actually, if you were to draw a line from Freedman's Village, Arlington, or Arlington Cemetery down to Green Valley, somewhere around there. The thing about Camp Casey is a camp of a regiment of infantry is going to be maybe 400 yards square, and the 2nd and the 23rd overlap. So you can double that, and you can double it again for a parade ground. So it's not one set of barracks, it's an area. And while the 2nd was there, they were in dog tents. So there was absolutely, except for scattered relics, there would be no actual trace of buildings or barracks. So it's in an area.
Okay.
Okay, and what about what life was like for the soldiers there?
You would actually, some of the general orders in the books of the 2nd USCT lay out the schedule that, you're up at sunrise, and there's time to clean up and, perform your morning ablutions. Then you have a sick call, you have breakfast call, and they have like 4 to 6 hours of drill a day.
Drill.
And then the men generally turn in earlier, and the officers a few times a week would have additional learning in the evening. They would sit down for an hour in the evening and recite the tactics, go through that Casey's infantry manual. Or actually, there was an edited version for colored troops that dropped all of the obsolete portions of Casey's, but it's basically the same set of tactics. They're living in tents when it got cold. The correspondent for the Anglo-African describes them being able to build chimneys out of bricks, so they had some heating before they went off to New Orleans and then Key West. But it's generally pretty basic camping conditions and a lot of drill.
Okay, thank you. Several people have asked whether or not the U.S. colored troop regiments trained on what's now Theodore Roosevelt Island in
Yes.
Arlington.
Yes.
You
Yes,
want to go ahead, Ben?
I'll take it. The first United States colored troops from Washington, D.C. were training there. It began because in Washington, D.C., there was some trouble with black soldiers walking the streets of the District of Columbia with guns. And a lot of the Southerners from across the bridge didn't appreciate black men with guns. And sometimes there was arguments and disagreements. So it was decided that they would go to Mason's Island, also known as Theodore Roosevelt Island. We have done a couple of living histories there, and it's not far. It's a nice Saturday afternoon visit. It's where they spent their time, the first United States colored troops. Now, the first United States colored troops was from Washington, D.C. Not everyone knows that Washington, D.C. had their own regiment. And this is where they trained because of what I said earlier. But we're real happy to represent them anytime we get the opportunity. Next.
Okay. This was an early question. Someone asked, and I think this is for Mike, if you could please speak again about where the longtime African-American soldiers from the second USCTs were from. You had said some were, well, please answer that, yeah.
Well, where they were from is an interesting question. You have birthplaces for people, and only a very small number are actually born in Alexandria. I think it's about 24 of the second, about 36 of the first. There's about 120 who were born in the greater, or in the District of Columbia. So it's Alexandria, Georgetown, and Washington City, which are all originally 3 separate cities within the district. When you get to the suburbs around, though, so basically, if you're looking at today's commuting distance, that's where you get about 2/3 of the regiment are local DC. The Baltimore recruits are coming from anywhere from Southern Maryland to, as I said, the Eastern Shore. The first 2 companies, as I said, are all in that region, the counties surrounding the Dismal Swamp in Southern Virginia and North Carolina. And then ultimately, once they get off to Key West, they recruit another 144 men who are from Florida. Some of them are born in Alabama and Georgia, but most of them are from Florida. Is that the answer?
Yeah, I think that's good.
Okay.
Someone also asked you whether or not Fort Jefferson, which is now part of the Dry Tortugas National Park, was used by the regiment.
It was not garrisoned by the second. However, there were a few court-martial cases that were serious enough that men ended up in Fort Jefferson, where you sent the hard cases. There was a murderer, and there were a couple mutineers who ended up incarcerated in Fort Jefferson, and that's the only soldiers of the second who were there during the war.
Okay.
The rest of, as I said, half the regiment is in Key West, including Fort Taylor, which is there in Key West.
Okay, thank you. Someone would like to know what Jefferson Brogues were. Are they shoes or are they boots?
I don't think any of us are wearing those, but I saw that question, so I went into my closet, and I have a civilian version of this. This is a Donaldson bootie. Now, let's see if you can
Yep, you
see
got
that.
it. You got it.
Jefferson Brogues is a little less fancy. It's a very basic shoe. It's cuts to lefts and rights, but there's no arch support. There's no padding. Your
Nothing.
feet get used to it, or you go lame. Basically, it's a Brogan. It's a heavy work boot.
It looks like a desert boot to me.
Yeah. Officers, on the other hand, are supposed to buy all their own clothes. So if I'm working at the Bureau of Colored Troops in the War Department, I'm wearing something like this.
Whoa.
It's a Congress gaiter. Much more comfortable. If I'm out in the field, I'm going to be wearing a Brogan.
Right. Okay, Lisa J would like to know how come blacks got half pay when they proved that they were excellent soldiers?
Can I deal with that?
I'm next. I got
the amendment of the Militia Act in July of 1862, while it allowed the U.S. Army to recruit African Americans, they made no distinction in pay between soldiers and contraband laborers. The pay for the laborers was $10 a month, with $3 withheld to cover the cost of clothing. Plus, you got a ration. In 1864, Congress finally got around to fixing that, and they passed an amendment to that act in July that provided that all African American soldiers in the United States Army would be provided the same pay as white soldiers. And for all of them, it was retroactive to the beginning of the year, so January 1, 1864. And if you were free at the beginning of the war, you got your back pay all the way to the date of your enlistment. If you weren't, if you couldn't certify free, you didn't get that. Now, in the 54th Massachusetts, Governor Andrew had fought so hard for equal pay all along that he had the men swear to what they called the Quaker Oath. Is that what you're going to talk about, Ben?
a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Well, first of all, black soldiers, it was thought, would not fight. They were thought that they were only good for labor battalions. It's crazy to me, if you want somebody to fight, somebody who's under the chain, wouldn't he make a better fighter? But it was thought because they didn't think that we had enough intelligence, and they took half our pay for those reasons that Mike related to. It's just crazy how they. Lisa, I hope you got all of that.
Well, it was a heavy lift for a lot of white people to believe that African Americans could be soldiers in the first place.
Yeah.
So there was a real reluctance to pay them. And it was a problem for not just as soldiers, but the United States Army at the time. Property management and discipline is all based on your pay. If you mess up, they take it out of your pay. If you break something, it comes out of your pay. If you're not paying people, and you're not paying the corporals or the sergeant major any more than a teamster, you got problems up and down the line. They were the final, I think the 54th drew pay like twice during the war, but when they finally got the pay and the back pay, it was a small fortune. Go ahead, Ben, I'm sorry.
No, that's quite all right. It's just that
I'm the admin geek.
I forgot where I was now. He was the soldiers fought gallantly, and again, why couldn't they get the same pay as others? They just didn't believe that they would fight. Now they paraded. They were in parades. The first the Louisiana Native Guard did a lot of marching, and people would come out to see them march. And the colored ladies would throw flowers. I've got to give a little shout out to the colored ladies. The colored ladies always supported their boys, and I call them boys, but they're men. Anytime they went out to parade or march somewhere, they were there throwing flowers on them, at them. and it was a source of inspiration and pride for the company and for the women that made up the colored ladies. So the colored ladies were a significant part of the colored soldier in the war. Thank you.
Okay, well, talking about ladies, Lindsay asks, she says, I understand that Clara Barton signed up as a social worker and nurse with colored troops from Massachusetts. Do any of you know more?
Ben,
We did a program at the house in Alexandria. I forget the name of it. We did a program up there, and I did a little research, and the rumor is that Clara Barton was smitten with one of the soldiers. There's a rumor. This is the rumor. And she was smitten with him, and he was married. And she was so sad when he was able to leave that she just cried and cried. Rumor. But Clara Barton was a significant warrior. There's a place down in Washington, D.C., I think it's G Street, where they uncovered her old office, where they had all these files and stuff, and they were there, and nobody knew about it. So they found, the Park Service got there, and they put them all in order and pulled out the files, and just some more history that we don't know about. Hats off to this lady, too. Thank you.
Thanks. Steve asks, you spoke of the Black soldier who was released from a POW camp. Wasn't the usual practice of the Confederacy to kill Black captives?
there were several notorious incidents in which Black soldiers were massacred by Confederates. Fort Pillow is the worst. The Confederate government was the primary offender here. Once they found out that Lincoln was going to start enlisting African American soldiers, including people who had emancipated themselves, they went back guano crazy. And they passed a law, the Retaliatory Act, that said, if you were captured, if you were a United States colored troop and you're captured by our side, the enlisted personnel will be returned to their owners or enslaved by the Confederate government, and the officers will be put on trial for inciting servile insurrection, which is a capital offense. So 2 things to take out of that. One is Stark fellows from New Hampshire and, Sergeant Richard Burton may have absolutely nothing in common and no reason to like each other. But once they both had the same noose around their neck, the Confederacy could not have done anything more to bring those guys together. Ben, you were going to say something? I'm sorry.
I seem to recall something about a black flag that the Confederates used. I know the charge was no quarter. It meant kill them all.
What happened was, it depended on who captured you and where you were at what point in the war. When you get down to the Petersburg front, where the 23rd was, after a few months, when Confederates start wanting to desert to the other side, they realize that, the United States Army has Confederate prisoners as well. And the United States Army will also be in position to take Confederate prisoners. So there's a period of sort of mutual slaughter that eventually works out to where people are treating each other with some respect. Mm-hmm. In the case of the second, there were perhaps a dozen men who were missing in action. And we can assume that the men who were captured several miles out of the way in the countryside of Florida may very well have been summarily executed. For those men who were captured at Natural Bridge, though, by more or less regular Confederate Army forces under a solid command, they know the end of the war is coming, and they know that they're not going to be winning it. So there are several men who were captured at Natural Bridge, wounded on the field, and they were all accounted for. Either they were returned under the flag of truce at the end of the war, or they were, there was one guy, I think, who died in captivity, and the regiment was so informed. Does that answer it?
I think that's good. The Kinsale family would like to know how often you all reenact and where your annual events are. And they'd love to come to see you after COVID.
Well,
Wow.
we typically will reenact a battle where there were black soldiers. We attend a parade once a year in Gettysburg. I tell you what, it's something to see. 30 or 40 black men, proud black men, parading through the streets, and the people in the street give them hell, 54th, give them hell, 54th. It makes you swell with pride. Now we have a battle in Lake City, Florida, Olustee. Olustee is one of our significant battles. That's usually in February. And we didn't do anything this year, only because we couldn't get down there because of weather, I think. Wilson's Wharf is another one. You'd have to look up exactly where it is, but that's another place. I see the notes that's come up. Am I through? Am I finished?
No, I put this up because if people want to learn more about you, there's their website.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. There you go.
Go
ahead,
We
Mike.
have living histories throughout the year, and Ed can probably tell a little bit about where the 23rd is active.
Mm-hmm.
Captain Gantt?
Yes. Yeah, the first one that comes to mind is in Falmouth, Virginia. There's an annual event every September called Yankees in Falmouth, which is reenacting the Union Army encampment there through the winter. And the 23rd is a big part of that. The 23rd is usually in the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania area, depending on the year. But the Spotsylvania Courthouse has an event typically, if not every year, every other year. And we get invitations to participate in much smaller events, but the larger battle reenactments, Olustee and Wilson's Wharf / Fort Pocahontas, which is down in the Williamsburg area, are probably the two largest nearby. I would add Cedar Creek, although there were no African-American soldiers involved in Cedar Creek when that battle was fought. But we have participated in that, augmenting other units. The Battle of Fort Stevens in Washington, D.C. in July, usually the second weekend in July every year, is a small living history, much smaller reenactment, but it's an opportunity to come on up and at least see how a soldier's camp would have looked, look at how the battle progressed, and every opportunity you take advantage of like that, you'll learn, you'll come away knowing a lot more than you knew before going. So we just hope that we can get back into the business of spreading the complete history as far as we can.
Hear, hear, I agree. Hopefully soon.
Yes.
Okay. Steve asks, could a slave owner in Maryland who was drafted send his slave as his substitute?
That's covered in the end of war report by Provost Marshal General Fry. There was a very, very brief period, maybe a couple weeks, in July of 1863 when the first draft was run, when they found out that some of the white draftees were hiring African-American men as substitutes. The general rule was that if you could provide somebody who would take your place before your reporting date, they would be accepted and you would be off the hook for the rest of their term of service. However, they very quickly changed that to where only white for white and black for black, because the whole point of the USCT was to augment the rest of the Army, not to substitute for all the white men who were liable for military service. So it very quickly became white for white, black for black. Now, a slave owner, on the other hand, in Maryland, if he emancipated one of his slaves, in order to enlist in the United States Army, there was actually an official United States Army manumission form. He would get the bounty that would ordinarily go to the soldier in return for freeing the soldier to serve in the United States Army. And at that time, 1863, 1864, I hate to talk about the market value of people, but the sale price of African Americans who were enslaved in Maryland had dropped. The bottom had fallen out of it because they generally made their money by selling surplus slaves further south. And there was no market once the shooting started. So that was actually a pretty good deal for the slaveholder. On the other hand, there were a couple recruiting officers of the USCT, including one, a recruiting officer for the 19th USCT, who was murdered in southern Maryland because while he was trying to recruit slaves enslaved people on a farm, in southern Maryland. So roughly no.
Okay, and the final question is, through the records, can you find out like what contraband camp a recruit was recruited from?
A recruit is going to be recruited at a recruiting station, and in many cases you have them set up near a contraband camp, but there's not necessarily a direct line. The camp on Roosevelt Island, there was an adjacent contraband camp, but like I talked about in terms of federal recruitment, they're drawing people from all over. So that's not really, all that's going to be in the record would be the enlistment station and place of birth.
Okay, all right.
Is that what you're going to say, Ben?
No, I was just gonna nod in agreement.
Oh.
Well, if I could add something to that, this is Ed. That answer is much more difficult because, with time, their contraband camps just seem to crop up any place where the Union Army remained stationary, and those who self-emancipated made their way to the Union lines after that decision to consider them contraband, and they were considered free persons at that point. So contraband camps just popped up in many places, with the largest one in the country, I believe, was down there at Fort Monroe, or right outside of the gates at Fort Monroe.
I just find it amazing that the slaves would volunteer to go away. They probably had never been off the plantation in their whole lives. I have family in Connecticut who live within 25 miles and they don't go anywhere else. I hope you're not watching. But it's just amazing. It's just amazing to me that they would have that much chutzpah to sign up and volunteer to fight the war. Amazing.
So
That is
I
amazing.
want to step in and I want to say thank you to our three presenters tonight and all the information that they've shared. This has been really great and really, like you said, sharing a piece of history that is sometimes hidden from a lot of others. I also want to thank our participants for hanging in there with our early challenges. This is a larger group than we normally have, and some of you have been kind to give us some suggestions for future large groups on how to manage them more, and I appreciate you hanging in as we got some things straightened out. You may now, if you have additional comments or additional questions, please feel free to unmute yourself if you have anything else, but thank you so much. We really appreciate, and Jessica for doing the chat line, but we really appreciate our three guests this evening and all that they had to share in telling this story. So if anybody else has any other comments or stuff, please feel free to, I know you're putting things in chat, but you can also unmute at this time.
So I have a question more about what recommendations do you have for how to do research on particular regiments? My husband's great-great-grandfather enlisted in the 65th U.S. Colored Troops, and I want to learn more about what their life was like in Baton Rouge from both primary and secondary sources, and I just wonder what recommendations you have for how to research that.
I'll take part of that. If you're close to the National Archives, is a good place to start. The National Park Service has a website that lists members in specific regiments.
Yep, that I have. Yep.
Okay. But I would suggest you try the National Archive. I don't know where you live.
Okay.
But if you're close to, and you can write to the National Archives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I can't tell you how overjoyed I was when I was flipping through pages, sitting in the archives, and I saw my father's name.
Wow. Yeah.
And I mean, I almost fell over in my chair.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, and I think you just have to go around and
The best general book, I think, I mean, everybody has their favorite, but the most comprehensive about the formation and activities of the United States Colored Troops is by a historian called William Dobak, D-O-B-A-K. The book is called Freedom by the Sword, and it's available as a free download from the Army Historical Center. So they have it on a PDF you can download. And I think that mentions the 65th, and it'll also give you an idea of where all these regiments were recruited and their service.
And do you know where the generals or whatever level it is that were in charge of, say, the folks stationed at Baton Rouge, were they required to keep daily diaries or anything? Are there any primary sources like that?
That gets back to Ben and the archives, but the Army ran on paperwork. There was actually an entire guide for how to keep the paperwork of a company. This is called the Company Clerk.
Yeah.
It was written by the same general who led the 1st Division of the 25th Corps, all African American, into Richmond in April '65. So yes, you would have morning reports. You would have tri-monthly morning reports. You would have monthly reports. So there's an awful lot of that at the archives.
So then I can just talk to a librarian to say I'm interested in and what were they called? The daily reports?
Morning reports.
Not all those have survived. The archives has some, but if you call them, if you can come to DC when they open again, there are some very helpful people in terms of telling you what the records are. You can actually go on the archives site and
I'll check. I
look up what records they still have.
Okay, yeah.
Are there regimental histories?
Yeah.
There are regimental books. Whether or not there's a regimental history depends on whether somebody wrote it up after the war. Like the 23rd USCT, there was an officer who left a memoir called As Glory, and he at least covers them from recruitment to the crater where he was captured.
Another place you can get information on military records is the military records, to the National Personnel Records. You can either go in person or you can contact them, and they will send you a complete list of where every person was stationed and at what time.
And that's called what? Military records?
Yeah, I just Googled it because I was on that site a few weeks ago. Just go on Google and ask, where can you find my father's military records? And they tell you where you go and everything that you want, and it will give you a complete history of where they were stationed while they were in service.
Yeah, I think I have those, but thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your help.
Quite welcome.
Well, if I could add one more book And this one stands out since it was written by an African American in 1887, George Washington Williams, a Civil War veteran. And the title is The Negro Soldier in the War of the Rebellion. I may have left a word out of that title, but you probably can't get more firsthand knowledge of
Who's
the
the author?
African American soldier's experience from someone who was there, and I find that one very interesting. That in 1887 we have that piece of written history, and too few of us know about it.
Yeah, and that was
What
George
is the
Washington Williams, you
author?
said?
Yes,
George Washington Williams?
yes, 1887, the Negro soldier in the War of the Rebellion.
Okay, I put it on the chat. Any other questions before we close out? Okay, thank you so much. It was a great spending the evening with you. Hope to see you on future events, and thank you again to our 3 speakers who really enlightened us tonight about the life of the colored troops during the Civil War. Thank you.
Thank you.
Interest.
Signing off.
Great, thank you.
Ben?
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm sorry for all those little things that happened at the beginning. We asked people to mute and turn off their video, but unfortunately, some people either didn't know how to do it or didn't get the message. But also, it ended well once we got going.
That was the time when my screen went blank, and it's still blank. But
That's
we
weird, but
couldn't
you
see
know,
any of
your
it.
presentation was excellent.
I had slides that we didn't get to see, though. Okay, maybe next time.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.